Picture yourself as part of the first generation of followers of Jesus. You do not have a book in your hands. You do not have a bound New Testament with a table of contents and numbered verses. What you have is something more fragile and at the same time more powerful than any book. You have the voice of someone who was actually there, someone who saw it, someone who heard it, someone who walked with Jesus or who personally knew those who did. That voice is everything in the first years after the resurrection. And while that voice is alive, the faith is alive. But time does not stop. The witnesses grow old. The communities grow beyond what a single voice can reach. Persecution comes and scatters the ones who carry the memory. And at some point, someone picks up a pen and begins to write, not because they planned it, but because the message the world needed to hear could not depend forever on human memory. That is how the New Testament was born, not all at once, not in a single night of isolated inspiration, but in the heart of a faith that was growing, suffering, expanding, and urgently needed to preserve what time threatened to take away. Today, we are going to walk through that process from the inside, from the earliest communities, from the first letters, from the moment when the living voice began to become written text, and understand why that process changed the history of humanity forever. To understand how the New Testament was born, you first have to dismantle an image most of us carry without realizing it. The image of a book that always existed exactly as we know it today, complete, organized into 2 testaments with 27 books in the New, ready to be consulted from the very first day of the Christian church. That image does not match historical reality. The New Testament did not appear all at once. It was born in stages. It emerged from concrete situations, from real needs, from communities facing challenges the apostles could not always resolve in person. And understanding that birth process does not weaken faith at all, it roots it more deeply because it shows that the sacred text the church has preserved and transmitted for 2 millennia is not an abstract document dropped from the sky, but the living result of the Christian mission in its most direct contact with history. If this kind of historical and spiritual exploration fires something in you, hit that subscribe button right now and ring the notification bell so you never miss a video like this one. Drop a like and share it, because what we are about to explore is the story of how the words that changed the world came to be written on pages that would cross the centuries. The earliest followers of Jesus lived in a world radically different from ours when it came to the transmission of knowledge. The culture of the first century in the Mediterranean world was largely an oral culture. This does not mean writing did not exist or was not valued. It means the voice, the physical presence of the teacher, the direct testimony of someone who had seen and heard, carried a weight that writing in that cultural context could not easily match. The first century Jewish historian Papias of Hierapolis, one of the early church fathers, wrote in the 2nd century that he preferred the living and enduring voice of those who had known the apostles to anything written in books. For him, as for many of his generation, the unbroken chain of oral testimony was more reliable and richer than any written text. That was the cultural environment in which the first followers of Jesus lived their faith and passed it on. What the earliest believers had then was not a New Testament. They had the apostolic preaching. They had the living testimony of those who had walked with Jesus, who had heard his words, who had witnessed his miracles, who had been present at the Last Supper, who had seen his arrest, his condemnation, his crucifixion, and his appearances after the resurrection. That testimony was transmitted in the gatherings of the first communities, in the breaking of bread, in shared prayer, in the reading of the texts they already possessed, which were the Hebrew scriptures that Jews called the Torah, the prophets, and the writings, and which the first Christians now read with new eyes, finding on every page anticipations and promises that pointed toward what Jesus had fulfilled. It is worth pausing on what that communal reading experience would have felt like. A group of people, mostly without their own scrolls, and many unable to read privately, gathering to hear someone read aloud words they had come to treat as sacred. The texts shaped not just their theology, but their rhythm of life, the questions they asked each other, the way they understood suffering, the hope they carried into each day. They had a great deal. But they did not yet have what we today call the New Testament. That would be born from the tension between the urgency of the mission and the inevitable limits of time and space. The first layer of the New Testament to appear was not the Gospels, it was the letters. And that fact says something extraordinarily significant about the character of the Christian sacred text. It was born from real life, from concrete situations, from urgent problems that required immediate answers. The letters of the Apostle Paul are probably the earliest New Testament texts that historians can date with reasonable certainty. 1 Thessalonians is considered by most specialists the oldest written text in the entire New Testament, composed around the year 50 after Christ, barely 20 years after the crucifixion, when dozens of people who had known Jesus personally were still alive. Paul was not writing a book. He was responding to a real community in a real city, Thessalonica, a port city in Macedonia in what is now Greece, that was wrestling with questions about what would happen to believers who died before the return of Christ. He was comforting, instructing, correcting, encouraging. And he was doing it with an authority his recipients recognized immediately as different from any other letter they had ever received. The apostle was not writing from personal opinion. He was writing from the revelation he had received and from the testimony he carried. That dynamic repeats itself in every letter that now forms part of the New Testament. 1 Corinthians responds to a list of problems the church in Corinth had sent to Paul through a messenger. Internal divisions, cases of serious moral failure no one was confronting, disputes about marriage and celibacy, confusion about spiritual gifts, errors in understanding the resurrection. Paul takes each of those problems and addresses it with a theological depth and practical application that has continued to guide communities of faith for 2,000 years. The letter to the Galatians is born from the urgency of a severe doctrinal crisis. Teachers who were arriving in the churches of Galatia after Paul's departure and insisting that Gentile believers needed to be circumcised and follow the law of Moses to be truly saved. Paul responds with a forcefulness you can feel in every line, because he understands that what is at stake in this controversy is not just a ritual question. What is at stake is the very core of the gospel, the declaration that salvation comes exclusively through the grace of God received by faith. The letter to the Philippians, by contrast, is probably the most personal and the warmest of Paul's letters, written from prison to a community he loved with particular tenderness, filled with a joy that completely defies the circumstances from which it was written. Each letter has its own story. Each one was born from a specific moment. And yet, through those specific moments, it speaks to every moment. One element that does not always receive the attention it deserves in discussions about the birth of the New Testament is the phenomenon of texts circulating among different communities. The apostolic letters were not designed to stay in a single church. The letter to the Colossians, in its 4th chapter, records Paul himself asking that his letter be read in the church at Laodicea, and that the church at Colossae seek out the letter sent to Laodicea and read it there. This reveals something very important about the process by which the New Testament was born. The texts were shared, copied, read aloud in gatherings, and sent from community to community. It is worth imagining that in concrete terms. A messenger arrives at a church carrying a scroll. The community gathers. Someone reads aloud. The words of the apostle cross physical space and reach ears that never saw him, people living in cities he may never have visited. And something in those words reaches them, addresses them, speaks to them with an authority that no other voice, however respected, had managed in quite the same way. In that process of circulation, something remarkable was happening gradually. Certain letters, certain texts began to be recognized consistently across different regions and by communities with no direct contact with each other as carriers of a special authority. Not simply because they were interesting or well-written, but because those who read them recognized something that distinguished them qualitatively from every other piece of writing traveling the same routes. The Gospels came somewhat later in the timeline, and their relative lateness compared to the letters has a historical logic that is deeply illuminating. In the earliest years after the resurrection, eyewitnesses were alive and reachable. Peter, John, James, the other apostles, and the hundreds of people who had personally known Jesus could be consulted directly. The living voice of someone who had been there was the primary resource. But time was moving forward. The apostles were beginning to fall. James, the son of Zebedee, was the first to die, executed by Herod Agrippa around the year 44 after Christ. Persecution intensified. Communities were multiplying geographically, reaching regions where no eyewitness had ever set foot. And as the years passed, it became increasingly clear that the living memory of those who had known Jesus could not last indefinitely. The time had come to record in writing what would otherwise risk being distorted, fragmented, or simply forgotten. There is something deeply human in that moment. Something anyone who has lost an older person full of stories can understand. The anguish of realizing that everything that person lived, saw, and knew will disappear with them. That anguish drove the first believers to do what human beings always do when something too precious threatens to vanish. They wrote it down. The Gospel of Mark is considered by most specialists the oldest of the four canonical Gospels, composed probably in the 60s after Christ. The earliest Christian tradition associates it with Peter. Mark would have been the interpreter or secretary of the apostle, and his Gospel would be essentially the ordered record of Peter's preaching. This explains several characteristics of the text that attentive readers notice: its urgent and direct rhythm, the presence of details that only someone very close to Peter could have known, the almost disconcerting candor with which it portrays the moments of incomprehension and weakness of the disciples themselves, including Peter. Mark does not idealize the apostles. He shows them as they were, with their greatness and their limitations, with their faith and their doubts, with their courage and their cowardice. That honesty has the flavor of direct testimony, not of hagiography invented centuries later. The Gospel of Matthew, which in current Bibles appears first, though it was probably written after Mark, has a very clear orientation toward the Jewish reader. It is the most structured of the four, organized in large teaching blocks, like the Sermon on the Mount, which gather the words of Jesus around specific themes. It is filled with explicit quotations from the Old Testament, presented with the formula that it might be fulfilled which was spoken by the prophet, connecting each moment of Jesus' ministry to centuries of Hebrew prophecy. Matthew writes for a community that knows the Scriptures and needs to understand how Jesus is the fulfillment of everything Israel had been waiting for. The Gospel of Luke, written by the companion of Paul, who declares in his prologue to have carefully investigated everything from the beginning and consulted eyewitnesses, is the most narratively polished of the four and pays special attention to characters the other Gospels mention only briefly or not at all. Women, the poor, Samaritans, the excluded. Luke writes for an educated Greco-Roman reader and wants to show that the story of Jesus is not a provincial story of a small Jewish sect, but the central event of universal history. The Gospel of John is the last in composition and the most theologically profound in its exploration of the identity of Jesus. It begins not with the birth of Jesus, as Matthew and Luke do, nor with his public ministry, as Mark does, but with eternity itself. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. John writes for a community that already knows the basic facts of Jesus' life and needs to understand them in their deepest dimension. His accounts are not a simple repetition of what the other Gospels recount. They are a meditation, a contemplation that carries the reader into the deepest waters of the mystery of who the one who walked along the shores of the Sea of Galilee really was. It is important to note that these four Gospels did not appear in a vacuum. In the world of the 1st and 2nd century, other texts were circulating that also claimed to tell the story of Jesus or of his disciples, but the communities receiving both the apostolic texts and those other writings experienced a difference that was difficult to articulate but impossible to ignore. The texts that today form the New Testament had something, an internal coherence, a connection to the apostolic tradition, a capacity to speak to completely different situations with the same force that the other texts simply did not possess in the same way. That recognition was not instantaneous or uniformly clear from the first day. It was gradual, extended over time, geographically distributed, and accompanied in some cases by genuine debate. But its direction was consistent. There is a period in the history of the New Testament that deserves to be mentioned with the seriousness it requires, because it illuminates in a way that no theological argument can match the value the earliest communities placed on these texts. The period of Roman persecution, especially the persecution under Emperor Diocletian at the end of the 3rd century and into the 4th. During that persecution, the imperial authorities issued edicts demanding that Christians hand over their sacred text to be publicly destroyed. Those who complied with that order were called traditores, from the Latin tradere, to hand over, the term that came into English as traitor. Faced with that demand, Christian communities made decisions that involved their lives. Hiding a sacred text could mean prison or worse, and yet thousands of believers chose to hide those texts, bury them, send them far away, copy them from memory if necessary, rather than hand them to the flames. The texts for which a person was willing to risk their life were, without any doubt, the texts that person recognized as absolutely non-negotiable. Persecution did not create the canon of the New Testament, but it revealed with brutal clarity what that canon actually was in the daily practice of the communities. The process by which the New Testament took its definitive shape of 27 books was gradual and not free of debate. Some texts that are today universally recognized as canonical faced certain doubts in some regions for a period of time. The Book of Revelation, which is in the New Testament, was questioned by sectors of the Eastern Church during the first millennium because its interpretation and its character were complex to integrate into regular teaching. 2 Peter raised some questions about authorship. Hebrews generated uncertainty about who wrote it, but all of these debates were resolved over time as consistent use, spiritual recognition, and the growing consensus of faith communities confirmed which texts carried the weight the others did not. The understanding that emerges from walking through this entire process is profound and has implications that go far beyond historical interest. The New Testament was not born because someone sat down one day to plan a sacred book. It was born because the most important message the world had ever heard needed to cross time without being distorted, without getting lost, without being trapped in the fragile memory of a single generation. It was born from the preaching of apostles who knew they would not live forever. It was born from the need of communities that could not hear Peter or Paul in person, but needed with equal urgency the same truth those men carried. It was born from the repeated experience of thousands of believers in different parts of the Mediterranean world who read the same texts and found in them the same voice, the same weight, the same capacity to illuminate whatever life brought. What began as the oral announcement of the resurrection of a carpenter from Nazareth gradually took written form, text by text, letter by letter, gospel by gospel, until it became the collection of writings that has influenced the history of human civilization more than any other. not because anyone had planned it that way from the start, but because the truth those texts carried had a force that no persecution could extinguish, no debate could diminish, and no amount of time has been able to render irrelevant. The New Testament reached your hands because entire generations of believers considered it so valuable that they chose to pay any price rather than let it die. And that, more than any theological or historical argument, says something about what those texts actually are. If this journey opens something new in the way you understand Scripture, hit that like button right now and subscribe to the channel so we can keep exploring the history and depth of the Christian faith together. Share this video with someone who wants to understand more deeply where the Bible they have at home actually comes from. And leave a comment. Which part of the birth of the New Testament surprised you most or meant the most to you? We would love to read your answer and keep this conversation going with you.